welcome in. I just wanted to talk about my VTuber making process and how I personally went about it. And I've included time lapses of both my art and the rigging process. There was a lot of videos that I ended up following because I honestly wouldn't have a VTuber without these videos. So I'll be talking about those a bit and kind of talking about the process and what I personally went through, whether it be like the struggles of making it or like the how I made the artwork for it, how I exported a little bit. This definitely isn't an in-depth video. I would highly recommend checking out the actual tutorial videos in case you were looking to make a VTuber, but I personally just wanted to kind of compile all my information and kind of have a nice packaged video of looking back and looking at all the honestly hard work that went into making my VTuber. It honestly took, I want to say, about 13 hours for the clip file, so the drawing itself, and it was a good other 10 to 15 hours in rigging alone. Some of the creators that I referenced, they're both absolutely amazing. I wouldn't have a VTuber without them. Their names are ḥaģa:ʍ and Cutie Dragon. And we're gonna go ahead and just get into the time lapse of the artwork of my model. So first I started out with a rough sketch and kind of went in and figured out my placement. I will say, if you're making a VTuber model, your symmetry tool is going to be your best friend with this, because you want things to be symmetrical, because when you go to rig it later on, you're going to be reflecting a lot of things. You can absolutely have asymmetrical pieces, you just have to rig those a little bit differently, but it can absolutely be done. But try to use the symmetry tool kind of as much as you can. It just makes things so much easier instead of trying to make sure everything is symmetrical when working on your file. So here I'm just making some of additional expressions that I ended up not rigging, but I plan on rigging them later on. I would have to go ahead and draw and make those parts separately. But I think it would be a great thing to go back to later on. What's nice about having the model is you can have it quite a bit done and still have more to go back and add, which is really cool. And so I'm just basically getting through my rough sketches here, and after all my rough sketches I go through my line art and then I get to color. I ended up already knowing how I wanted the pieces to be separated when I started this, so I basically went through and I kind of thought of it as a paper doll, but also a jointed doll, if that makes sense, because each part is going to move essentially. So you kind of wanted to have almost like joints, like in the shoulders and in the legs, like hips and torso, and of course all your other parts. And then you can have the clothing on top of it all separated into layers. For mine, I already had absolutely everything separated, from my line art to my color to my shading and lighting, and then I went back and I merged everything back together. So you will have to have them merged together. Not everything though. I won't have a breakdown of everything that needs to be separate, because like for instance faces are really complex and such, but I would highly recommend checking out ḥaģa:ʍ's videos on how to cut models and separate them. I had already drawn my model separated instead of going through and drawing one thing and cutting it later on. It just kind of was a lot easier for me to do it that way. And here I'm just going through some lighting and shading. So after all the rendering is done, then it can be exported as a PSD to Live 2D, and then you can go ahead and start rigging. I also went ahead and drew the internal mouth parts as well. I'm sure that there's other tutorials that can talk about all the parts that go in there. There is I want to say a few that I referenced, but there's quite a bit around. I also decided to draw a coat, a t-shirt with the sleeves up, and then a shirt with the sleeves down that I later on added toggles to, so I'm able to turn them on and off during stream. And we're gonna get into rigging soon. So I already had my eyes rigged. It took about 4 hours. I honestly wasn't confident in my rigging, and it wasn't till later I started recording it, but I'm glad I did start recording it. But I'll still leave the tutorials in the description, and I have them pictured up here as well. They'll be on screen in a moment, so you can reference those for eye rigging and eyebrow rigging as well. So these are the two videos. They are both by ḥaģa:ʍ. So here I'm just making my meshes. I'm honestly doing the entirety of it. You may not see it, but I was following the videos through and through. And I also referenced ḥaģa:ʍ's mouth rigging tutorial. I followed her reference pictures as well. Honestly, her tutorials go into so much information, and they're so helpful and clear for me. And also as well, in case, say, those tutorials don't quite work for you, there's plenty of different styles of tutorials that I'm sure you can find that will work for you to follow. I know some I couldn't quite follow, yet others were easy to follow. It just really depends on your personal preference. I will say my mouth rigging is pretty rough, in the sense of it was like one of the first things that I ended up rigging, so I didn't rig the inside of the mouth quite good, but it suffices in the sense of you're not zoomed in on it all the time, which for me I was okay with. But if you want to, you can make it a lot cleaner. If I were to go back, I probably would make the mouth a lot cleaner. I wasn't too good with rigging the inside of the mouth. What happened was I wasn't quite paying attention to how I was moving the pieces of the mouth. My points were getting all overlapped, and kind of, it didn't make for an even warp. So what happened, things look a little bit weird and not smooth. But for me, it did suffice. But if I had the time, I would go back and fix the rigging as well. It kind of made it harder in the end when I was rigging it to the sides, because it ended up, points were so overlapped, it made it hard to rig a little bit. So if I were going to redo it, I would definitely take your time and make sure that you're not warping things to where they overlap weird, and because if you do, you're going to be getting some really weird results. this point I started to get the hang of things, but as you can see, as I was making my mask for the mouth, you can see points are acting really weird, so that's why I highly suggest making sure you do it right and that your meshes are correct. But by this point, it's essentially have your object make a warp deformer on that object, and then go ahead and make a keyframe at either end of the keyframe spectrum, and then you can go ahead and move your object and animate it. After a while, you kind of get used to going in that order. So once you get the hang of it, things are pretty much smooth sailing after that. And for the teeth, they do look a little weird, the top teeth, but I ended up changing those later on. So I took away the lines and they do look a lot better. So next we're going to get into rigging the head. So we're going to make it look left and right, and I also followed Chipico's tutorial for this as well. It took a minute to get the hang of it, but it is really fun to be able to see a 2D image almost mimic or look 3D, but it's only because it's simply distorted. It's still completely 2D, it just looks 3D, which is a very, very fun concept. I loved watching everything come together. These I would also make sure you go through every single keyframe and move it around. You can see that I have about 3 different lines of keyframes. It's very good to go through each keyframe to make sure everything is matched up and moved and lined up, because if not, you're going to miss it and suddenly your part is going to be in the middle of your screen rather than moving with the head. So it's really important to go through every single keyframe, even ones that are not connected like that. I would say just go through all of them, move them at different angles, move one keyframe slider one way and the other another way, and then check to make sure everything's just lined up and looking good. It does take a moment to get the hang of, but once you get it, you know to look through everything and make sure everything's good. I would also make sure that you keyframe after you resize your bounding box on your object. I would do that a few times where I would put a keyframe and resize the bounding box, but it would think that I was keyframing the bounding box so the bounding box would move, not the object. So I would keep that in mind. And I would also highly recommend a video on deformer hierarchy. It is very important. So here's a video by Cutie Dragon that is really good at explaining the hierarchy. In the beginning, I was not very good at understanding the hierarchy, so at least what's nice is Live 2D will tell you, hey, you can't do that. You can't have this deformer within this deformer. So it will let you know, but it may take a moment to figure it out. But it took me a while to figure out, but thankfully I did reference the video and it kind of clicked in my head and I was able to eventually get everything to work and running smoothly. I may not know the ins Well, I might not know the ins and outs of Live 2D. I will say warp deformer hierarchy is very important. For me, I kept getting it highly confused in the beginning, and it took me a minute to figure it out, but once you do figure it out, it comes smoothly. So while it may be frustrating at first, everything will go right. For everything, I essentially went through, and when I was moving the mouth, I went through, opened up the mouth, and looked at every single keyframe to make sure it wasn't overlapping weird or just doing weird things in general. As you can see here, I'm going through and tweaking a lot of it just to make sure that it looks right. Now, if I went back, I would do it a little bit different. Speaking of physics, I actually did follow a tutorial by ሓꈍꈊꈍgsmå on jiggle physics, which I ended up using for the wool and the ears as well. So it is a little bit more complex of a thing to do, but I feel like once you understand your warp deformers, moving your objects, and your physics, you'll definitely get the hang of it, and it's really fun to see it come together, especially when I first added the jiggle physics to my eyes. It was so cool and so much fun. So here I'm just kind of going through the wool and I'm adding a lot of jiggle physics. There was a lot of warp deformers, but trust me, they make sense. And ሓꈍꈊꈍgsmå actually explains that really, really well. So I highly recommend that tutorial. I will say, well, you guys can't see it here, I was referencing my physics window, so that actually helps a lot. If you do the posing and you kind of watch and have it make random movements, it'll really tell you what might be wrong where, and you can go back in and fix it. That was definitely a lifesaver for me because I was able to pick up and see things that were going wrong, and I could go back in and tweak it. And also, as a side note, if it looks like my cursor is going crazy and it's just moving all over really weird, it's because I'm actually in the physics menu. My OBS wouldn't capture that window because it was separate from Live 2D, but I am doing things behind the scene. Unfortunately, I don't have any recordings of the physics or actually going in and setting them up. So both ሓꈍꈊꈍgsmå and ሓꈍꈊꈍgsmå do have videos on that, so they explain it really well and they make a lot of sense to explain the physics. So after I got my X and Z, or essentially left and right movements, or also the up and down, I essentially went through and took each object and molded it to the form. Like, for instance, I was looking down, and so I molded the hair to look down. So that's essentially what I'm doing. Every piece on the face has to have that done. So it does take a while to get it done, but again, once you kind of get used to everything and you know how to do everything, make your warp deformers, warp your objects and such, it becomes a very smooth process. In fact, after a little while, I didn't even need the tutorials until I was doing something new. So it is nice. It just takes a little bit of learning, but once you get it, it does help you. You're able to just kind of take the reins and do what you need to do. So I ended up doing a different method for the bells. So I followed this tutorial by Cutie Dragon. It's for tails, but I actually applied it to both my herbs and knives, and then I also applied it to the bells. So it's called skinning, where essentially what's nice is you put a rotation deformer. I only needed 2 because my object was so small. And then for my herbs and knives, I actually only needed that 1 deformer. And essentially, it automatically creates parameters for you, which is really, really nice. And then you can go into your physics deformer, or your physics, and you can set them up. Everything is kind of made and ready for you, which I find this method way easier than trying to hand do it, especially if you want something to just simply rotate like a swing. I will say, if you get some really weird results, like as you saw my bell split weird, I will say you probably need less rotation deformers, so that way it isn't breaking everything up strangely. So here I'm going through all the keyframes and essentially making sure that those bells, or essentially you can do this with any object as well. Like I mentioned, go through every keyframe, make sure everything's sitting correctly and in the right placement. Because sometimes you might miss a keyframe, and then it might look like everything is suddenly ruined. But trust me, you just have to go back and tweak one small thing. That is what's quite nice about it, is you can look through every keyframe, make sure everything is correct, and if something's wrong, don't worry. Just kind of take your time, look through everything, and make sure it's ready. So next I ended up rigging the body. I once again followed Chupiko's video. So my walk is a little bit weird, but not terrible. Here is the video I followed. But I'm content with it because honestly most of the time you're just looking at the chest up for my VTuber model, which isn't too bad. Some people don't even do full bodies as well. That's another thing, is if you really wanted to, you could really do like a waist up or shoulder up. It's really up to you how much you want to rig. I will say it does take a good chunk of time to rig everything, but I just wanted to kind of have the full body in case I wanted to move around and such, so it wouldn't be cut off. I will say at one time while I was rigging the coat movement, I forgot to add an art mesh to the object. So I would definitely make sure everything has art meshes, because I was honestly sitting there for a minute wondering why it was not moving the way that I wanted it to, and then turns out I just simply didn't add an art mesh. So it's kind of, sometimes you have to go back and add the little things, but that's the nice thing, is you can do undos and then go back and fix it. So nothing is ever completely ruined. I would keep that in mind. So you can always go back and fix it. I will say, I know during this part and during the mouth rigging as well, I was having a pretty hard time. I was like, I really don't like this, it doesn't look good. But honestly, I feel like if you kind of see it through, it's gonna look rough, and as they say, trust the process. But it took me a minute to get it ready, and I think I wouldn't sweat the small stuff, honestly. I was getting a little too stuck on the small stuff and I wasn't able to move forward. So I will say, keep in mind some of the things might be so small you might not even see them. I understand wanting perfection, but as this being my first time model, it wouldn't make sense for me to be overly perfect about it. And here I rigged the ears with the jiggle physics as well, and then I went ahead and reflected them, which again makes it so much easier because you're able to also keep all your keyframes, and so they move in the same motion. So I do highly recommend keeping it as symmetrical as you can. So for the final tutorial that I ended up following, it is a toggle tutorial by ሓꈍꈊꈍฟ้. So this is how I ended up making my short sleeve shirt, my long sleeve shirt, and my coat turn on and off by buttons. You can actually kind of see it here a little bit. There's my coat. So I ended up following that tutorial. I will say the way I did mine was I have my sleeves separated from the rest of the garment, and essentially I toggled those on for the shirts. But for the coat, I toggled the opacity for the entire thing. And ሓꈍꈊ does a great way of explaining it. She also later on talks about how you can turn those toggles on and off in VTube Studio, which was really, really helpful. As a side note, I ended up doing the parameters, the essentially keyframes and parameters on the object in the wrong place. I didn't make a separate warp deformer, which was a mistake on my part. So essentially every time I would look left or right, the opacity would be affected, which was not what I wanted. So I would highly recommend making separate warp deformers and then putting your toggles on that, because if not, you're just gonna get some really weird results, and trust me, it wasn't what I wanted. But thankfully, again, you can always go back and add it. Nothing's really ever ruined per se, so if you do mess up, don't be too hard on yourself, because you can always go back and fix it. That's one of the things I had to learn really quickly, is it's not ruined. You can always go back and fix it, and to also be kind to yourself too, especially if it's your first model. I was being extremely tough on myself. At first I really liked it, and then some parts I was like, wow, I hate this, but honestly, I'm so glad I stuck it through, because I'm so happy with the results. So essentially that's it for the rigging. So I will say there are some other tutorials that I'll be referencing as well. But honestly, rigging was so much fun. I got to see like some very fun parts of it as well. So you can get some really fun, interesting faces, like this one that I'm making right now, that I ended up using for things. Or you can even get this one. It's fun to see the entire process. But so here are some of the tutorials that I ended up using. I followed Chupaco's how to export to VTube Studio, and then I also personally use VBridger. That actually helps the tracking so much on my model. So enjoy this fun little montage of everything coming together. These are like little physics windows, and you get to see my model kind of come together, and it was so much fun, honestly. there we have it. That is the model rigging portion. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm actually going to show you guys my VTuber showcase as well. And there you have it. This is the completed model showcase. I had a lot of fun working on this model, and I really love how it turned out. I kind of wouldn't mind making another model later on, but honestly, this was so much work, I wouldn't even begin to think about making another model. Well, that's kind of a lie. I'm already thinking about possibly making a Halloween version for next year. But I really did enjoy this process, and I really am grateful for all the tutorials that are out there, because I would have had absolutely no idea how to make this model had it not been for those tutorials. Personally, I found that the two that I used helped me a lot, and I hope they help you as well. So thank you so much for watching, and I really appreciate it.